Imagine standing in the heart of Georgia, in a time when segregation was law, and racial injustice was a cruel reality etched into the daily lives of millions. The air is thick with tension, but beneath it, there is an unshakable sense of hope. Hope that something will change. Hope that a new day is on the horizon. In the midst of this unrest, Georgia would become not just a backdrop to history, but a battleground where the very soul of America would be tested. The fight for civil rights in the 20th century would be shaped by the blood, sweat, and unwavering courage of the people who dared to demand change. In the early 1960s, Georgia became a flashpoint, a state where the spirit of the civil rights movement would take root and ignite fierce struggles that would echo across the nation. The epicenter of this seismic shift was Atlanta, a city that would transform from a segregated Southern stronghold into a symbol of hope and resistance. But the road to progress was fraught with peril, and it was here, in the shadows of Georgia's past, where many of the movement's most powerful figures would rise to lead. One of the most enduring images of the civil rights movement is that of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., the man who became the voice of a generation. Born in Atlanta, King's journey toward greatness began long before he stepped into the national spotlight. His very existence was tied to Georgia's complicated history. The streets he walked as a child were lined with the echoes of injustice, but also the whispers of resilience. Atlanta, in the mid-20th century, was a city divided. The deeply entrenched racial segregation left Black Americans with little opportunity, relegated to second-class citizenship at best. Yet it was here, in the midst of oppressive laws and brutal discrimination, that the groundwork for the civil rights movement was laid. King, whose family had deep roots in Georgia, was a product of this tension. He wasn't just a preacher, he was a catalyst. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., a prominent pastor in Atlanta, had instilled in him the belief that faith and justice could coexist, and that the struggle for civil rights was a divine mission. In 1955, the spark that would light the fire of the civil rights movement came not from Georgia, but from a woman in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks. Parks's refusal to give up her seat on a segregated bus sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, but Georgia was right in the thick of the action. A young lawyer named Julian Bond, who would become one of Georgia's most influential civil rights leaders, was just one of many who felt the call to action. Bond would go on to help found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, an organization that played a pivotal role in Georgia's struggle for civil rights. His work would intersect with King's at every turn, and together they would fight to dismantle the systems of segregation that ruled the South. But Georgia's role in the civil rights movement wasn't just about famous figures. It was also about the everyday people who risked everything for change. In the early 1960s, the sit-in movement swept through the state like wildfire. Young college students from historically Black institutions like Morehouse College, Spelman College, and Clark Atlanta University, armed with nothing more than determination and a sense of justice, began to stage peaceful sit-ins at lunch counters across the state. These brave students, some as young as 18, were subjected to violence, ridicule, and arrest, but they refused to back down. Their message was simple. Segregation had no place in a society that claimed to be free. One of the most powerful sit-ins took place in the heart of downtown Atlanta, at the beloved Rich's department store. On March 9, 1960, a group of students, including future civil rights leader John Lewis, sat down at the lunch counter demanding to be served. The white workers behind the counter refused. The students didn't flinch. The store's management called in the police and the students were arrested. This act of defiance would become one of the most iconic moments of the sit-in movement, sparking further protests in Georgia and across the country. At the same time, Atlanta was rapidly becoming a hub for the movement's legal battles. The city was home to some of the nation's most influential civil rights organizations, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, founded by Dr. King. The SCLC worked tirelessly to challenge unjust laws in the courts and to lead large-scale nonviolent protests like the 1961 Freedom Rides, which tested the federal government's commitment to desegregating interstate bus travel. The Freedom Riders, both black and white, faced violent opposition as they boarded buses in Georgia, but their actions brought national attention to the cause. Georgia became the battleground for one of the most profound tests of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As the movement gained momentum, Georgia's leaders became increasingly vocal, but they didn't just speak with words. They used action. In 1963, Georgia's capital city would see one of the most iconic events in the history of the civil rights movement, the 1963 March on Washington. While it was a national event, the march had deep roots in Georgia. It was Dr. King's stirring "I Have a Dream" speech that would resonate across the globe, reminding America and the world that the fight for equality was far from over. His leadership in Georgia, his calls for nonviolent resistance, and his ability to mobilize people from all walks of life made him the face of the movement. But Georgia's story in the fight for civil rights isn't just about the victories. It's also about the setbacks, the betrayals, and the brutal resistance that sought to maintain the status quo. The Ku Klux Klan, which had a strong presence in Georgia, stood as a vicious symbol of hate, targeting black leaders and their allies with violence and intimidation. In 1963, the tragic bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, served as a grim reminder of the lengths to which segregationists would go to stop the movement. Yet the tragedy only galvanized the cause, pushing Georgia's activists to work harder, faster, and with even more determination. The culmination of Georgia's civil rights struggle came in 1965 with the Selma to Montgomery marches, where Dr. King's leadership was critical in securing the Voting Rights Act. But it was also the courage of people like John Lewis, the young leader who had been a part of those early sit-ins in Atlanta, that helped to turn the tide. As a member of the SNCC, he had witnessed firsthand the violence of the segregationists. Yet he stood firm. It was Lewis who, in the face of a police blockade, would march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, inspiring the nation to support the passage of the Voting Rights Act. While many of the battles of the civil rights movement were fought on the streets of Georgia, it was the hearts and minds of the people that were ultimately changed. By the time the movement reached its apex in the late 1960s, Georgia had undergone a transformation. Atlanta, once a symbol of segregation, became a beacon of hope, home to a new generation of leaders, educators, and activists committed to carrying the torch of the civil rights movement forward. By the time Dr. King was tragically assassinated in 1968, Georgia had begun to see the fruits of its labor. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 would change the course of American history, and Georgia was at the heart of that transformation. The state had not only borne witness to the struggle, but had been an active participant in creating a new reality for future generations. As we look back on Georgia's role in the civil rights movement, it's clear that this was a state where the impossible became possible. It was a state where ordinary people became extraordinary leaders, where courage and conviction collided in the streets, and where the fight for justice became a clarion call heard around the world. The history of Georgia in the civil rights movement is one of transformation, not just of a state, but of a nation. And as we remember the struggles of those who came before us, we honor their legacy by continuing the work they started. For in the heart of Georgia, a dream was born, and that dream still lives today.